On the morning of March 3, 1943, a fleet of modified American bombers came in so low over the Bismarck Sea that their propellers were kicking spray off the wavetops. They were heading straight for a Japanese convoy of 16 ships, 8 troop transports and 8 destroyers, carrying nearly 7,000 reinforcements to the Japanese stronghold at Lae, New Guinea. The bombers weren't diving on the ships from altitude the way air attacks usually worked. They were flying level, at mast height, releasing 500-pound bombs that skipped across the surface of the ocean like stones across a pond, and slammed into the sides of the transport ships at the waterline, exactly where armor was thinnest and flooding would be fastest. Within minutes, the convoy was burning. Within 2 days, it had effectively ceased to exist. This is the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, the engagement that proved for the first time in the Pacific War that land-based air power alone could annihilate an entire naval convoy, and the battle that permanently ended Japan's ability to reinforce its forces in New Guinea by sea. To understand why this convoy existed at all, you have to understand what Japan had just lost. In January 1943, Allied forces had finally captured the Japanese base at Buna, on New Guinea's northern coast, after months of grinding jungle combat that had cost both sides dearly, a story we've already covered in the Ghost Mountain Boys episode. With Buna gone, the nearest major Japanese positions were at Lae and Salamaua, further up the coast, and Tokyo's planners understood that unless those garrisons were reinforced quickly, the entire Japanese position in eastern New Guinea would begin to collapse. The plan was straightforward on paper. Load roughly 6,900 troops of the 51st Infantry Division onto 8 transport ships at Rabaul, Japan's massive forward base on the island of New Britain, escort them with 8 destroyers and roughly 100 fighter aircraft, and sail them across the Bismarck Sea to Lae. Japanese staff officers, running their own war games before the convoy departed, gave the operation only a 50-50 chance of success. They predicted losing 4 of their 10 transports and up to 40 aircraft. They decided to proceed anyway, because the alternative, landing the troops at the more distant port of Madang and marching them over 140 miles of roadless jungle, swamp, and mountain terrain to reach Lae, was judged to be even worse. On the Allied side, they were already waiting. Naval codebreakers in Melbourne and Washington had intercepted and decrypted Japanese messages revealing the convoy's destination and approximate arrival date. Lieutenant General George Kenney, commanding the Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific, knew the convoy was coming before it left port. What he didn't have was confidence that his bombers could actually stop it. Up to this point in the war, Allied air attacks on Japanese shipping in the region had been, by Kenney's own honest assessment, mediocre. Conventional high-altitude bombing against moving ships at sea had a hit rate of roughly 3%, good enough to occasionally damage a vessel, but nowhere near reliable enough to destroy an entire convoy. Kenney needed something fundamentally different, and he'd spent months preparing it. The answer was skip bombing, a technique Kenney and his staff had been developing and practicing since the previous year, partly inspired by similar ideas from the Royal Air Force. The concept was deceptively simple. Fly a bomber at extremely low altitude, practically at wave height, release a bomb with a slight delay fuse so it would skip across the water's surface and strike the hull of a ship at or just below the waterline, the same way a child skips a stone across a lake. Where conventional bombing from altitude required precise calculation of ship speed, wind, and altitude, and still missed most of the time, skip bombing put the aircraft close enough that accuracy became almost intuitive, at the cost of flying directly into the teeth of every anti-aircraft gun on the target ship. To make that survivable, Kenney's crews had another innovation: modified B-25 Mitchell bombers and A-20 Havocs, rebuilt by a resourceful maintenance officer named Major Paul Pappy Gunn, who had stripped the bombardier's glass nose off the aircraft and replaced it with batteries of forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns, turning medium bombers into heavily armed gunships that could strafe a ship's deck and suppress its anti-aircraft crews on the same pass they used to deliver their skip bombs. In the weeks before the convoy sailed, crews practiced relentlessly, skip bombing a wrecked ship on the reef outside Port Moresby until they stopped missing. The convoy left Simpson Harbor, Rabaul, on February 28, 1943, sailing northwest through heavy weather that the Japanese commanders deliberately chose as cover, hoping the cloud and rain would shield them from the Allied reconnaissance aircraft they knew would be searching for them. It worked, briefly. The convoy was spotted by a patrolling B-24 Liberator through a break in the storm clouds on the afternoon of March 1st, but the weather closed back in almost immediately, preventing any coordinated attack for the rest of that day. RAAF Catalina flying boats tracked the convoy through the night, relaying position updates that let Kenney's staff plan exactly when and where the main strike force would intercept the following morning. For the next 24 hours, bad weather largely shielded the convoy from the full weight of Allied air attack, though B-17 Flying Fortresses managed to find and strike it on March 2nd, sinking one transport, the Kyokusei Maru, and damaging two others. It was a conventional high-altitude attack, the kind that had always been unreliable against ships. But on this occasion, the B-17S managed to scatter the convoy and force the Japanese to pick up roughly 950 survivors from the sunken ship. Two destroyers rushed those rescued troops to Leh overnight, the only significant number of reinforcements from the entire convoy that would ever reach their destination. Then, on March 3rd, the weather cleared for the first time since the convoy had left port, and the Japanese ships sailed into the range of everything Kenney had spent months preparing. The convoy was now passing through the Vitiaz Strait, the narrow passage between New Britain and New Guinea, within reach of every bomber and fighter aircraft Kenney could put into the air. The attack came in coordinated waves that had been rehearsed down to the sequence each unit would fly. First, Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters swept in at mast height, strafing the decks of the convoy with cannon and machine gun fire specifically aimed at killing or scattering the Japanese anti-aircraft gun crews before the bombers arrived. Within minutes, 13 B-17S and 12 B-25S struck from medium altitude, dividing the convoy's defensive attention and forcing ships to maneuver independently. Then came the main event. Modified B-25 gunships and A-20 Havocs from the 3rd Attack Group roared in at wave-top height, strafing the ships with their nose-mounted .50 calibers as they closed, then releasing their skip bombs at point-blank range. Some pilots released their bombs from distances as close as a few hundred yards, so low that spray from near misses hit the underside of their own aircraft. Behind them, more B-25s from the 38th Bomb Group followed with additional skip bomb attacks from similar altitudes. The results were devastating, and the difference between the old way and the new way of attacking ships at sea was written in the numbers with unmistakable clarity. In the space of roughly 15 minutes of concentrated low-level attack, on the afternoon of March 3rd, the skip-bombing aircraft alone claimed 17 direct hits, a strike rate of 35% at low level compared to the roughly 7% hit rate achieved by the medium and high-altitude bombers attacking the same convoy from above. The contrast was not lost on anyone who studied it afterward. High-altitude bombing against ships had always been an exercise in probability. Skip bombing, as demonstrated here, was something much closer to precision. By the end of the day, half the transport ships had already been sunk or were sinking, and most of the rest were on fire or dead in the water, Their crews and the soldiers packed below decks left with almost no options except abandoning ship into water that Allied aircraft were still actively patrolling. Overnight, Navy PT boats attacked what remained of the scattered convoy, finishing off at least one transport already listing past any hope of survival. By the morning of March 4th, all 8 Japanese transport ships and 4 of the 8 escorting destroyers had been sunk. The 4 surviving destroyers, themselves damaged to varying degrees, managed to rescue just under 5,000 of the troops who had been in the water. But instead of continuing to Leh, they turned around and carried the survivors back to Rabaul and Cavien, their mission abandoned. Roughly 3,000 Japanese soldiers were dead, most of them drowned or killed by strafing before they could reach shore, and of the 6,900 troops the convoy had set out to deliver, only about 1,200 ever reached Leh, most of them the survivors picked up by destroyers on the night of March 2nd, before the main attack had even begun. They arrived without most of their equipment, weapons, and supplies, which went to the bottom with the transports. What happened in the water after the main attack remains, even decades later, one of the more uncomfortable episodes of the battle. On March 4th, Allied aircraft returned to the area to attack lifeboats, rafts, and Japanese survivors still in the water, actions that, by the strict letter of the laws of war, were deeply problematic regardless of the military justification offered at the time. Kenney and other commanders defended the follow-up attacks on the grounds that any Japanese soldier who reached shore alive would become a combatant again, and that previous experience in New Guinea had shown Japanese troops would refuse to surrender and fight to the death once ashore, an argument that, whatever its military logic, sits uneasily alongside the visual reality of aircraft strafing men clinging to wreckage. It remains one of the aspects of the battle that historians continue to debate honestly, without easy resolution. The wartime propaganda that followed the battle inflated the results beyond what had actually happened. American newsreels and newspapers reported 22 ships sunk and 15,000 troops killed, numbers roughly double the actual figures, partly because the chaos of the attack and the repeated waves of aircraft involved had led to massive double counting of ships already sinking when subsequent waves arrived. Kenney himself was not above embellishment. His initial report to MacArthur claimed numbers significantly higher than what post-war Japanese records would eventually confirm. And MacArthur's headquarters in turn issued communiques that further inflated even Kenney's already inflated numbers. When Army Air Force headquarters in Washington investigated the discrepancies in mid-1943, MacArthur's staff insisted the original higher figures were correct, a bureaucratic stubbornness that kept the inflated numbers in official American records for years. The real numbers were devastating enough without the exaggeration. In 3 days of sustained air attack, land-based Allied aircraft had destroyed an entire Japanese convoy, every transport, half the escorts, using techniques that 6 months earlier hadn't existed outside of practice runs on a reef outside Port Moresby. The strategic effect was immediate and permanent. Japan never again attempted to send a troop convoy across the Bismarck Sea to Leh or anywhere else on the New Guinea coast within range of Kenney's aircraft. Future resupply attempts were reduced to submarines and small barges hugging the coastline under cover of darkness, a trickle where a flood had been needed, and even those barges fell victim to strafing A-20s and B-25s with increasing frequency. In April 1943, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto attempted to redress the situation by launching Operation I-Go, an air offensive from Rabaul designed to destroy Allied ships and aircraft in New Guinea and the Solomons, an operation that achieved little and that Yamamoto himself did not survive. On April 18th, exactly 1 year after the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, American codebreakers intercepted and decrypted his planned inspection itinerary, and P-38 fighters shot down his transport aircraft over the Solomon Islands, killing one of the most important naval commanders in Japanese history. The Japanese position in eastern New Guinea, already under pressure after the fall of Buna, began the long, irreversible decline that would eventually see Lae itself captured by Australian forces in September 1943, less than 6 months after the convoy that was supposed to save it went to the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. For the Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific, the battle proved something that had been debated since the earliest days of military aviation, that properly trained and equipped land-based air power, operating without any naval support at all, could find, attack, and completely destroy an enemy naval force at sea. It was the kind of result air power advocates like General Billy Mitchell had argued was possible since the 1920s, and that conventional naval officers had spent 2 decades insisting was fantasy. The Bismarck Sea didn't settle that debate permanently. Carriers and surface fleets would remain essential for the rest of the war and long after. But it demonstrated, in a way no previous engagement had, that the debate itself was no longer theoretical. Skip bombing, validated at scale for the first time in this battle, became a standard anti-shipping tactic for Allied air forces across the Pacific for the remainder of the war. The modified gunship B-25s and A-20s that Pappy Gunn had improvised in a maintenance shop became, almost overnight, the model for purpose-built attack aircraft that would carry the fight to Japanese shipping, airfields, and ground positions across the theater for the next 2.5 years. Kenney himself, never one for understatement, sent a message to every bomb group involved after the battle that captured both the scale of what had happened and his own genuine pride in the men who had made it work. The whole gang, he told them, had written some important history. If you want to hear the full story of the Battle of Buna, the fight that made this convoy necessary in the first place, that's a story we've already told in the Ghost Mountain Boys episode. Let us know in the comments which forgotten battle we should cover next.